Let's turn now to Cairo. Joining us from Cairo is Egyptian journalist and author Ethar El-Katatney. Ethar, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Ethar, will you start out by providing a little bit of context? Because I do think Americans are a little confused, as we so often are. And just, if you were to sketch out sort of... the situation where it's like we're coming back into the movie after 45 minutes have elapsed and we don't know what has happened in the intervening time. Mubarak steps down in March. What then happens between then and now to get us to the situation we are in here?
Trust us. We're just as confused as you are. Situation right now, it's been an analogy to kind of delivery, childbirth. That we had a revolution in January, and then 9 months later, we're in the middle of a very, very messy childbirth. The country is in complete chaos, complete division. You have people, we have elections in 2 days. People have no idea what the elections are about, who the candidates are, what they're actually voting for, what houses of parliament there are. People who are going to the polls are like, who are we voting for? What are we voting for? And not only that, the expectations were that elections would have been complete chaos. And now you put in consideration that there are these huge protests happening in Tahrir Square, and people don't really know what's going on. Who are the people? What do they want? All right, so they say we want the removal of the military, we want a transition to civilian rule. But who is the civilian rule? When Mubarak was removed from power, there was military to take over. But the military goes, who's going to be in charge? There's a very... people are very weary. There's post-revolutionary, there's uncertainty. They just want to return to normal, because when you have a population, 40% of which lives under the poverty line, they don't really care about politics. They see the very basic day-to-day existence. Food, I can send my kids to school, and all they see is that we had a revolution, and actually our lives are harder now. The economy is completely going, we have, I think Standard & Poor's just downgraded. We have debt. We have unemployment's up. All the indicators is that the economy is actually much worse. And people are very, very tired. We actually had huge protests yesterday for SCAF, people they actually called themselves people of the couch, which I guess party of the couch, which is equivalent to, armchair activism. Right. That we're calling, we want SCAF. You wanted them to set a timetable. This was the original reason for the protests. People went to the square because they believed the military wanted to impose super constitutional principles to make sure that even with a transition to a civilian government, that they would still be separate. So it's kind of like, we'll give you this authority, you'll have civilian rule, but we're still in charge. You had 15,000 military trials. The Interior Ministry was overhauled, but the changes were extremely cosmetic. You have that the military is still the sole source of political legitimacy and authority, and the trials of Mubarak and all people were chaotic. So what people saw is that 9 months, you didn't actually do anything, that it kind of looked like it's actually a coup, that here is a regime where one arm of the regime, which is the military, decided to throw overboard the Mubarak to maintain power. So that's originally why people went. So they went to demand, we want you to give us a timetable to tell us when you are going to leave. And the military did that. They said, all right, we're going to leave in the middle of next year, in the end of July. But people still stayed, and that's what caused another huge majority, another huge division. And that's, I think, the core fear of Egypt now, is that there's these huge divisions, and Egypt is not Lebanon. We're not a small country where divisions where you pit, whether Islamist against secular, rich against poor, or the city against the countryside. This is creating very big fault lines with the country. And the military is very much an old, military rule, military mentality, military background. The mistakes of the Mubarak regime is that they were very slow to respond to people's demands. And the military has the same kind of problem. There's actually jokes now, that the only thing the military's done in 9 months is they added an extra digit to the phone numbers, and they time. That's all that's been accomplished in 9 months. The government that just resigned, Assam Sharaf, that had huge legitimacy in April, and now people are against them. And literally the problem is that there's no one qualified. Who's going to be in charge? The position of prime minister was offered to everyone. Everyone refused. Eventually, Ganzouri, who did decide to take over, people will go, oh, he's from the old regime, from Mubarak. But the reality is, which we have to accept, is that pretty much everyone is. Right. The political system in Egypt was done in a way that the only people who reached positions of political prominence
came up through
were people who were somehow tied to the regime.
Ethar, let me just ask you this, because it seems like if we were just sort of diagramming the sort of players in the post-revolutionary Egypt, there is the SCAF, which is essentially like our Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's the people that run the military and have been associated often with the Mubarak regime. The general in charge right now was the head of the Defense Department, essentially, right, for 20 or 30 years. There are then the protesters in Tahrir. Who are the protesters in Tahrir now who have been sort of in the streets? What kind of constituency do they represent? What is their worldview and perspective?
This is the core question that's been debated on our talk shows day and night, day and night, day and night. Who are they? They are youth, they are young, they are people who weren't even born, you know, when this new prime minister is taken over. They are extremely fragmented, extremely divided, and there is no focus. See, this is the problem. There is no leader. There is no one who can speak for them. There is no way we can say that Tahrir represents Egypt. Egypt is 85 million people. There are so many political parties, you know, I think of it as 30 years of absolutely no political anything, no parties. This politics wasn't even part of their kind of thinking. And suddenly you have a multitude of parties. People don't even know who these parties are. All they kind of knew was the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's a whole different kind of thing, you know, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. They refused to actually participate in the protests, and they want to go to the elections. And that poses a different kind of ideology, because they've always been considered, you know, a front runner, that if we have this parliament, they're going to take over. But their refusal to kind of join, it's created all these internal divisions within the party, and that's worried a lot of Egyptians who supported them, even not just because of their social work, but because of the name. Oh, the Muslim Brotherhood, we know them, we're safe. This is always a core of Egyptians. We want what we know. This is why someone like Omar Suleiman, who was vice president with Mubarak, still has this kind of credibility, is because we want who we know. The uncertainty, the unknown, is what's causing a lot of people to simply turn against the people in Tahrir, that we don't know. There's a fear of foreign intervention, of chaos, of the rabble. We're frustrated. We just want things to be normal. And that's what's causing people to not even want to know who are the people in Tahrir, what they want. It's more like, we have elections, let's just get them. If it doesn't happen, go back to the square, which is a kind of a conundrum, because it's exactly what was said with the constitutional. If it doesn't happen, go back to the square, which is what they did. But oh no, leave the square now, come back.
Ethar, I want to ask you if it's okay to hang on for a second. We're going to take a break, come right back. We want to talk more about this after the break. Awesome. Okay, great. All right, we have on the line Ethar El-Katatney, who is a journalist in Cairo, Egypt, with an amazing Skype connection, which is fantastic. Way to go. Okay, I want to. So just so that we're clear, we have Scaf, who is essentially overseeing this transition to elections and democracy, and yet I was calling around talking to different folks yesterday, some Egyptians, some sort of experts in the region, and one of the things that cropped up was that there doesn't seem to be any document out there that says this is what we're going to do. And so the SCAF decisions seem kind of ad hoc, and ultimately it comes down to how much you trust them, whether you think they're actually really trying to steer the country towards democracy, or whether they're essentially trying to embed themselves so that they will be able to run the country. And that is part of the cleavages in Egyptian society, is the degree to which people trust it. And we have this poll, Gallup has been doing a lot of polling, showing Egypt expecting fair elections to happen on Monday. You have 71% thinking that the parliamentary elections will be fair, which is not the feeling of those who are in Tahrir. My question to you is, what is your sense that the party of the couch, which I think in the American version of that we call it the silent majority, the people who are not in the streets, what is your sense of how they are watching this unfold, particularly with the escalating violence by the security forces directed at the protesters being displayed on Egyptian television every day?
Yeah, the problem is now is that there's a complete lack of trust, you know? Let's go back. If in January, if Mubarak had from day one said, oh, I'm appointing a vice president, here's when I'm stepping down, I have a feeling a lot of things would have died down a lot faster. It might not have ended with him leaving. And that's kind of the same situation. Things escalate, you know? The reason the protests this week turned bloody so fast is because of a trigger-happy police. It wasn't because if they'd gone to Tahrir the first day and the military had announced the first day, all right, we're doing, things might not have turned out so bad. But the more things escalate, the more the demands increase, and the less likely people are to leave. You've had at least, at last count, at least 40 people have died, 3,000 injuries. Comparative to actually the timing, there was actually a really interesting article in Foreign Policy Today, which was talking about how Tahrir Square, you have the same energy, you have the same revolutionary spirit, but we're not going to be holding concerts there anymore. It's much more violent, it's much more aggressive, it's much more angry, it's much angrier than it was before. And the military is a lot of people who are used to a system. We live in a country where we are taught, or we are raised, it's your people, they make the decisions. The military's not going to be like, all right, we've made a decision, oh, it doesn't work, let's sit and discuss it and see what we can do. Right. It's very much, oh, this is what we're doing, that's it. So to change that, it's not going to change in a day and night, and people are extremely impatient. Right. They don't want to wait.
Well, it also... Sorry,
yeah.
it also seems that, I'm sorry to interrupt you, it also seems that part of it is that there is no, you talked about sort of wanting to get back to normal, but there is no normal channels for politics. It basically seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong in this impression, that you either sort of go along with what SCAF is doing or you take to the streets, but you certainly can't like show up at the SCAF, office hours and tell them that you're bummed out or send them a move on petition saying you don't like this decision. All of that, all of those politics, all of those sort of channels for registering discontent with the status quo or pressuring leaders that are short of showing up in Tahrir don't exist. So it's a kind of, it seems like it's an either or. You're either saying, okay, SCAF, do whatever you want, or you have to take to the streets.
It's true. It's pretty much, and that's also because, like we said, we're in a political kind of vacuum where the revolutionary narrative, we're still writing it. But when you talk to people, it's extremely hard. And don't forget, Cairo, Egypt isn't just Cairo. If you go out into the upper Egypt, into villages, it's a very different story. I can't tell people, oh, you know what? You're going to be living a really hard life for 10 years, but your children are going to be living a good life. When you have people who live a day-to-day existence, their income is day-to-day existence, that's all they see. They see short-term. They can't see long-term. I can't tell them, oh, you know what, by the way, actually, our economy, we have 2 to 3 months. Our 7% annual growth has now become 1%. Stock market has tanked. Foreign reserves have fallen by 40%. Unemployment's now 12%, not 9%. All these things, they're not going to register. All they see is, oh, look, I'm not making money. My life is harder. So it's either I'm going to take to the streets, or it's either I shut up and deal with it until they actually make it work. And SCAF is, what's the strategy? How many people are going to be in Tahrir? The most estimate, whatever, 500,000. Egypt's 85 million. And a very clever thing was done in Tantawi's speech. He said, if you want us to leave, we'll have a referendum. Right. And that's the reality. It's either that it's very clever that is Egypt's mood, or, it's an overestimation of their popularity.
And the referendum, it should be noted just for the viewers, that the referendum for the party in power has a veneer of democracy to it, but is a sort of tried and true a move by particularly leaders in the region. Saddam Hussein, of course, would have referendums on whether he should stay or go all the time. It's not true democracy, right?
Well, at least it won't be, like Sadat and Abdel Nasser. We used to have, my parents would tell me there used to be things like the fetus in his mother's stomach has voted yes. 99.9%. So you have that. And the reality is, if you're using a gauge, let's say taxi drivers, this was actually a tweet I read today, if we consider them in Egypt the kind of pulse of the Egyptian, the reality is that Egypt would be much more pro-normalcy and pro-SCAF than people let on. Because even the chants of people in Abbasiyya, which was the pro-SCAF rally yesterday, it's down with Tahrir. The people are turning against Tahrir, saying that Tahrir does not represent us. And it's a very scary parallel to exactly what happened in January when we had the Mubarak pro-Mubarak protests. They weren't so much pro-Mubarak as they were pro-stability. The idea that anything that causes chaos must necessarily be bad, that the unknown must necessarily be negative. And I also want to bring up one more point.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, just one more point, because when I heard you talking before I came in about the U.S., I think this is also a very interesting point. There's been a huge discussion now in Egypt about the tear gas, that the tear gas is much more violent. It's a carcinogen. It causes much huger damage than the tear gas that we used before that's been sold by the U.S. And you were discussing the idea of the Obama administration, and I have to admit, it's a very difficult position where they're in right now. You have to struggle. We want to create this balance between democracy and stability. But the military, Egypt is not Syria, where the U.S. can afford to kind of stay back because, they don't really have. But Egypt is such an important player. Egypt's relationship with the U.S. is vital. And we have, like you said, the peace treaty with Israel. That's very important to maintain for the U.S. And the U.S. criticizing the military, which is the primary kind of control over this agreement, it's a 30 years. You're kind of putting a fault line in your relationship with the military, and that's very dangerous for the U.S. And there's also the risk. There's been huge discussions why, the Arab region never revolted. And always one of the core reasons is because the U.S. will not financially, but not morally support a democracy which might result in Islamists taking over. And that is kind of the fear here, right? I'm sure that the U.S. is, what if we go against the military, we ends up in a democracy where the Islamists take over, and then we're putting at risk our treaty. So it's kind of a position where you have to, hedge your bets, play both sides of the field. And it's also something that a lot of Egyptians are very aware of, that you're not really on the side,
right.
You're only on the side of the civilians when it seems like we're kind of overtaking or might win, which is exactly the same position that was in Egypt.
Ethar, I'm going to ask you to stick around one more break, if that's all right, because we the panelists, I have some folks here who want to ask you questions. We're full of questions about what's going on in Egypt. So stick around. You stick around at home. Okay. We'll be right back. All right, we have on the line Ethar El-Katatney. Sorry that I mangled that. Oh, you're very kind waving at the camera. And Ethar, we have Nancy Giles here wanted to ask you a question.
Ethar, first I just want to say your explanation of what's going on in Egypt is so clear and so thoughtful, and I know we all really appreciate getting a handle from somebody that's there. Have you thought about running for office yourself? Because you've communicated all the differences, the different factions, the feeling that's going on. I'm so impressed by you.
And which one of the 130 parties would you run a ticket on?
Or make a 131st party?
Yeah, no, I'm an objective journalist. Politics is a dirty, dirty game. And also, I just wanted to say, I just saw a tweet that said I was an American.
I saw that too!
Yeah, I'm a totally Egyptian, born in Saudi Arabia, lived all my life here. I've only been to the U.S. once, and that was only 2 months ago. So totally Egyptian. I can show you my desert out of the window right now.
Can you explain, though, this is a silly and superficial question, but can you explain why your English is so awesome?
I watched a lot of cartoons growing up.
This is going to be great for the parents of the world to see how cartoons do work.
Ethar, Eli Lake, who's a national security reporter with Newsweek and the Daily Beast, wanted to ask you a question.
Ethar, thanks so much for doing this. I just wanted to ask you very quickly, could you say anything about the state of security on the streets, especially after, in the initial revolution, we saw so many reports of how the jails in some cases were emptied. Do you have any trust in the police to do their job and actually police the streets? And can you kind of talk about how that's played into the dynamic in Egypt right now?
There's actually been a really interesting Gallup study that's just been released a couple of weeks ago, and they were comparing the actual fear of people, what we call baltagiyya, which is kind of slang for thugs, versus the actual crime rate. And the reality is that the crime rate is actually very, very close to the reality. It's just that the media hype is just the coverage of crimes, and you have also state TV, which is the same kind of ploys that were happening in January, kind of take care, there are going to be thugs, there are going to be, with the logic being that, if we don't have stability, the country's going to fall into complete disrepair, anarchy, which was kind of exactly what Mubarak said on TV in January, that if I leave, complete chaos. So it's kind of playing on heartstrings, especially of parents, of that your kids is going to be danger. And whenever there's one, so for example, in January, there was a situation where one hypermarket, Carrefour, was completely vandalized. They played that over and over again, so it kind of magnifies the crime rate. Police, the riot police, there's complete and total not just distrust of them. That's always been, the police have always been an entity that people have completely hated, and that's because of police torture. And you have the case of Khalid Said in Alexandria last year, which was actually one of the catalysts of the revolution. But it's just that the reality is, we'll be very honest, it's not going to change. You cannot change a mentality of a system in a day and night. It's kind of like people who talk about sexual harassment in Egypt. Just because we had a revolution and people say, we're all going to change, it's not going to happen in a day and night. It's going to take generations to change. So even though you had an overhaul, the actual core of the police is not going to change. People do not trust the police. But the problem is now it's more like, is the army controlling the police? And if they're not, because if they are, that means it's bad, because it's the police who are causing the bloody clashes in the actual, and I know you have Mona Tahawi, she will tell you her interview is that the people who actually assaulted her were the police, not the army. Right. So if the army is not controlling the police, then that means the army is doing something bad. But if they're not controlling the police, it means they don't have control over the police, so it's a lose-lose situation.
Ethar, let me ask you this. You just mentioned state media. Is it correct that the state media still exists and is still being run by SCAF, right? I mean, there still is a sort of official propaganda outlet for the current government.
The Egyptian state TV website was actually hacked a couple of days ago, and kind of like complete insulting jokes on it because of you taking us for that we're all stupid kids. there'll always be a mentality of cheer for the leader in kind of any public. This is, you know, we're a country where last year, I don't know if you've known, there was a huge incident over a Photoshop photo of ex-President Mubarak, where they Photoshopped him in front of Obama. The complete, you know, violation of ethical principles or journalism. And this is the biggest newspaper in the country, just went up and said, yeah, it was metaphorical, you know, it's completely, where editorial, you know, the line between editorial and between marketing, between a whole different things in journalism in Egypt. But the reality is it's a very much cheer for the leader. You know, you had a day where it's like millions support Mubarak, and then the next day, oh, we won. So it's not as intense. There's been definitely a lot of change in the media, but we've increased on reporters. I went to the museum in the US, and it was actually showed that Egypt on Reporters Without Borders, we've actually, you know, unfortunately slipped back down in kind of press freedoms. So there's still very much a mentality of cheer for the leader, and there's also, you have to admit that the military is, of course, exerting pressure on, you know, not overt criticism. You've had some of the most vocal bloggers or political activists detained, and actually for tweeting, you had Asma Mahfouz, who was one of the proponents of the revolution, a lot of people who are imprisoned, a lot of the military trials for vocally speaking against. So that's why media is still, it's not like freedom has changed in a day and night. There's still very much
there is still repression and recriminations being directed at people that use their platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or blogs, or write things that are critical of the current SCAF ruling regime. They still face.
Yeah, they do. And the answer to that is, for people who say, you know, that the media is giving us a wrong image, is, you know, like someone was saying, you change the remote control, watch all the media outlets, read everything, and they'll give you a more coherent picture. Or better yet, go down to the square and you'll see. It's definitely better. We're definitely moving more in terms of media freedoms, but we're a very, very long way away.
Finally, Ethar, I want to ask you this question, and I know it's an incredibly fluid and dynamic situation, so I'm not going to lean on you for a prediction of what comes next. But I guess you're speaking to an American audience right now, and I think to the extent that people have the revolution in Egypt in their minds, I think there's a fear that there's the same fear of instability. There's the same fear that the Muslim Brotherhood is going to take over the country of Egypt, and it's going to throw the peace treaty with Israel out the window, and Egypt will go from being an ally to an Islamist force. And we see some of that rhetoric in some of the politics around the GOP primary debate. What is your sense, what would you say to an American audience about that scenario, about the fear of that scenario, and how likely you see it? What is your feeling about Egypt's future?
The reality is this Islamist fear is something that's always been present, right? It's always going to exist, whether this is in Egypt or around the world, whether it's in Tunisia, of what it actually means, not just for the country, but for U.S. relations with them. Egypt is in a very, I think what the revolution showed us in January is that the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, this huge bogeyman that was created, you know, it was used by Mubarak as a tool to show to the U.S., you know, oh, this is why we need emergency law. This is why I restrict, because this is why I don't, because if I don't do this, this Muslim Brotherhood, this extremely scary kind of bogeyman is going to take over. But what the revolution showed, that didn't actually happen. And the liberal movements, the secularists, the left wing that was created after showed that that Egypt is a very kind of divided country. It's not Lebanon. We're not going to hopefully not divide into like hundreds of factions, but it's not as, if you go down into the street and talk to people, the Muslim Brotherhood isn't, they actually, if they want to win, if they actually want to gain any kind of substantial, they will have to adopt a much more moderate, much more centrist, much more dynamic rhetoric. Their political role and how it fits, you know, with their social work and their traditional kind of preaching, they kind of have to figure it out, because people don't want, especially youth. You know, there are estimates that since the revolution, at least 6,000 of their members have left, of their young members of the Muslim Brotherhood, because it isn't so much, there's all these internal divisions over how we're moving forward. It was easy before, you know, there are challenges. We were just like, oh, we're arrested, we're being beaten, you know, we have battles with the riot police. So they get the sympathy vote. But the challenges now are very different. It's very much a, how are we showing that we're actually good? Yeah, how we're gonna win. So,
Ethar, I'm sorry to cut you off. I've asked you a very open-ended question. We're up against a break. Ethar El-Katatney, thank you so much for joining us from Cairo. That was incredibly enlightening. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
We'll be back after this.